Espresso is simple on the surface. You grind, you dose, you tamp, you extract. But the Specialty Coffee Association wants the barista to master every variable. Instead of having to go through their courses, which can range from 7 hours to 14 hours to 21 hours, cost multiple hundreds of dollars, we're going to do this in short form videos where you can sit, binge, and have that same type of education, if not a little better. So let's go ahead and jump right into all of that. The way this video will work is we'll start with equipment and grinder fundamentals, espresso recipes and ratios, dosing, distribution, and tamping, extraction principles, measurement and tools, and then sensory and tasting. So use the time cues below because even still, I tend to ramble. So let's get right on in. Right here, I have a Sage or a Breville dual boiler. Now, of course, this is not a commercial machine, which you'd see in shops, but the idea is the same. Inside, we have a couple of boilers. In commercial machines, you also will have multiple boilers, and the reason is because you need to be able to steam on demand and extract on demand. And so that's what this machine allows us to do, being a dual boiler. It is fed through tubes or through usually brass tubes or through stainless steel tubes into the group head. Of course, we don't have brass and stainless steel tubes in the Breville, but in commercial machines you should, and then it comes out through that dispersion disc into our basket. Now the basket is going to dictate the amount of coffee you can use for your extraction. So baskets can come in various shapes and sizes, going deeper or more shallow, different hole shapes, different hole geometries, different hole amounts, and all of that will dictate how the water is getting through or how that espresso is going to flow. Some of them will be labeled like a 20-gram basket or an 18 to 19-gram basket. Don't look at that. You need to be dosing it based off of volume. I always recommend you will fill it up as much as you can, tamp it, put it in your machine, and lessen the dose until you don't have an imprint of the screen in the dry puck. Easy as that. Now, some people will use like a penny or some sort of coin, and they'll put it there, and if it pushes the penny into your bed, that will also tell you. But essentially, you want to dose based off of the depth of the basket, not based off of the grams on the side, because all coffee weighs differently. So we have our portafilter, and we have our basket, which locks with these two kind of wings, I always call them, into the group head, which is either brass chrome plated or stainless steel. Inside, we usually have a brass dispersion block above the dispersion screen that feeds to the boiler. Within espresso machines, we have different kinds. We have E61s, which first came out in 1961, and those have a thermosiphon type of unit, which means you need to, for the most part, flush between every shot. I just flushed. Because of the way that they're heated in the separated boiler from the group head and the overheating of water in the boiler in order to heat up that whole big chunk in the front, you need to flush between each shot or it has the potential of overheating. Thankfully, in the 80s, we started seeing the saturated group from La Marzocco, and with that, we don't really need to do these flushes nearly as much, especially with more intense PID controlling that has come over the years, as well as more understanding of thermodynamics within all of these different metals. Some commercial machines might have heat exchangers. I have a whole video going over that if you want to get into the nitty gritty, but essentially you have a steam boiler and inside there's a little tube that I call the brew tube. Brew water is refreshed every time into that brew tube and it uses the heat of the steam boiler to rapidly heat the brewing water. So there are usually two main types of pumps, the vibratory pump and a rotary pump. Now, rotary pump, you can also have gear pumps, which are a type of rotary pump, but regardless, these are different types of pumps you'll find in espresso machines that will push the water from the water reservoir into the boilers, and it will displace the water in the boiler in order to push out water to the group head. So vibratory pump works on vibrations. You have a pump that's held into two little rubber gaskets, and it vibrates. And so you have a piston that's going in, out, in, out, in, out, in, out in order to push the water. With rotary pumps, obviously, there's a rotation going on. Most home machines have vibratory pumps. They're much cheaper. You can buy them off the shelf, and they're just very inexpensive to replace. Rotary pumps and gear pumps tend to be a bit more expensive, and they're much more silent than the vibratory pump counterpart. In commercial machines, you likely will see rotary pumps all the time. I will say there is a new one that's kind of introducing itself called a volumetric pump, and this is more like a syringe, okay? And it displaces water like a syringe would, so it's much more approximate as well as silent. Thankfully, it's not like in the late 1800s where you literally had to be certified in order to operate an espresso machine due to the high pressure and the need to release pressure every so often. There was a literal certification in order to be a barista and actually work on those machines. Nowadays, we just have to not be dumb. So first off, if you turn this knob here, hot water is going to come out of the spigot. Don't have your hand there. If you turn this one on here, steam is going to come out of the wand. Don't have your hand there. Don't grab the wand unless you know you have a double insulated wand. You don't want to burn yourself. Make sure cords are out of the way. Make sure that you are using clean rags for the steam wand, that you're not using to wipe everything else down. Let's make sure that you are not cross-contaminating everything altogether. We want to be clean on bar if you're a barista. Make sure that things are out of the way. There are no electrical potential issues. If you make a spill, clean it up. Clean out your grinder every so often by opening up the burr chamber. Take a little brush, scrape it out. Yes, you can use those little pellets called grinds or something like that, but it's good to get it out and clean it every now and then. You can have buildup and old coffee in there. It can get kind of gross. Make sure you maintain the machine, but we can go over that more in detail later. So essentially within grinding, we have two burrs that are largely selected for cafe and home grinders. These are flat burrs, and these are conical burrs. Now, these burrs are going to have a great effect on that coffee and on their particle size distribution. That's a fancy term for how many particles at each diameter do we have in a given dose. Flat burrs have long been lauded as being able to give you more clarity, more nuance, a bit thinner body, whereas cone burrs have historically been lauded as giving you more chocolatey coffees, thicker bodies. That's not all of the truth. I always like to say the potential threshold for clarity and all of those things is much higher with a flat burr geometry start. But of course, lots of different burr geometries, not all of them go for that. There are a few that do, and they cannot be matched with conical burrs. For me, cone burrs have a much more inherent risk of heat damage on your beans due to the way the beans interact with the burrs themselves, especially under high stress, so lots of grinding during a shift. And they tend to give you a bit more astringency or a bit more of a drying feeling due to the fact that it tends to overheat during the grinding process. Not necessarily the chamber overheating, but the way that the beans are interacting with the burrs in the quick crushing, you're getting a lot of compounding heat going on, whereas flat burrs do a much better job of spreading out the breaking and crushing process. Whereas there are differences between the two, and the likelihood of you pointing at a cone burr and pointing at a flat burr and the flat burr having higher clarity is a legitimate potentiality. It doesn't mean we should just sit there and have a generalization at all times. If you were on a cafe with 58 millimeter burrs versus 98 millimeter burrs, you have much faster shot times as far as the dose goes with a 98 millimeter. It's a difference between maybe 4 seconds and 8 or 9 seconds, right? In the same way, cones, smaller, slower, bigger, faster. Also, the bigger the burr, the more spread out that potential heat issue is. So bigger tends to just be better all across the board, and you have much more potential with your burr geometry. So in a cafe setting, bigger is going to be better 9 times out of 10. The way that we increase grind size and decrease grind size, which just means the nominal peak or the average diameter of our coffee particle, is by making more space between our two flat parallel burrs, making more space between our cone and the collar burr, or making less space. You have grinders that are either stepped or stepless. Now, stepped means that you can go and it clicks. There's nowhere in between two different clicks, which means you have a predetermined amount of movement those burrs can make between each click. Whereas a stepless one is one where it is just really nice brass threads, and essentially you can turn it to any angle you want. You can do just a tiny little 0.5 millimeter, or you can do a full centimeter. Doesn't matter, you have the control over it. Of course, it's much more precise using a stepless, unless you have a stepped one that has insanely tiny movements like 3 microns or 5 microns, in which case it's about the same as far as your capability to repeat your grind size. Stepped grinders are going to give you the capability to get back to a grind size much more consistently and reliably than a stepless grinder. With stepless grinders, there can be a bit of lag, or there can be a bit of movement that you may not be quite aware of that can change it up if you're trying to get back to a grind size 2 days later and you have it written down somewhere, for instance. Ratios, brew recipes. So essentially, the core Specialty Coffee Association framework for a recipe is dose in, yield out, in time, which would be something like 18 grams in, 36 grams out in 28 to 32 seconds. That's kind of the standard SCA type of espresso shot you're going to run into in these classes. Rules are meant to be broken. The traditional rules are set up for old school Italian espresso, which is absolutely not the best. In fact, if you're still someone that thinks that Italy has the best espresso, just know when the prices of coffee went way up in the 1980s, all across Italy, they took a much cheaper coffee in order to maintain their margins and make sure that coffee was still affordable. And after that price craze went away, they kept sourcing that much cheaper coffee because no one really cared. So after that, they were just doing a lot cheaper coffee. So maybe in the 80s and before, relative to the world of coffee, maybe they had decent coffee. But nowadays, they're using really, really cheap coffee in their normal cafes. I'm not talking about the specialty shops in Italy, but just know it's an historical fact. For 45 years, they have been using much cheaper coffee than they did at one point in time for their supermarket coffees or typical cafe experiences. Don't let the romance sell you. They classify a ristretto as a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-1.5, which means 18 in, 18 out, or 18 in, 24 out, somewhere around there, in about, 25 seconds, 30 seconds, something like that. Now, the idea with a ristretto is to give you a heavier, more syrupy body, though it will inevitably be quite a bit more sour unless you're able to use a grinder that has the potential of high extraction. Normale is just the typical 1-to-2, so it's a balance of sweetness, acidity, etc. That's kind of what is the ideal shot in this canon. Next would be the lungo, which is a 1-to-3, so 18 grams in, and then you have about 54 grams out. And this is going to give you a lighter body. You're going to have more extraction, likely a bit more astringency could come in if you extract it a bit too highly, but at 1-to-3, probably not. Maybe a bit more balanced overall, in my opinion, especially with lighter roasted coffees. The first thing I want to demonstrate are these ratios. So I'm going to pull a ristretto versus a lungo, and we'll just look at those two differences really quickly. A lungo, which is a 1-to-3 ratio, and a ristretto. If you do this same thing at home, I would recommend starting with the lungo because it's going to be a lot less concentrated and a lot less intense on your tongue and won't be as coating. The other one, can't say the same about. This one's actually quite nice. It's got a lot of caramel apple. It's got some, there's a little bit of dryness, but it has a solid body. It's very balanced. The tactile is refreshing and not super coating. It's a great espresso. Now for the ristretto, this one I'm going to imagine will be a bit sour, a bit salty, but will give us a really pungent kind of tactile experience. Still pretty good. The acidity is a bit more intense in this one, actually. Not much saltiness. The tactile is definitely much more syrupy and thick, but the balance is not quite there. There's kind of a lemon bitingness to it, even though this is a darker roasted coffee. But overall, I definitely prefer the lungo between the two, but that doesn't necessarily always mean the case. If I was using one of my favorite Italian blends, which I do enjoy some Italian dark roast if it's well-sourced coffee. The crema bar I do closer to a ristretto and prefer that. But in this specific case, the lungo is much better, more balanced, and overall a more exciting coffee. Now, of course, I could have cut the middle and done a 1-to-2, but where's the fun in that? Let's move on. For a long time in cafes, there were doser grinders. So you would fill a chamber that was in front of the grinder, and then there would be fans in that chamber. And there was a doser on the side, and with every dose, it would move that fan one tick. The doses would be in between those little fans, and with every click, it would push one section out and would refill as it kept going around. So there's no accuracy, there's no consistency. They're just relying on a really dark roast that will allow them to not even really tamp. They can just kind of push their bed of coffee against the little plastic tamp that's on these grinders, and they'll get a slow, decent extraction. And it's because when you use a really dark roasted coffee, The water wants to stay in those grounds. It's very soluble beans. They'll get in there. There's a ton of CO2 built up from how long the roast has been, and it's just a much easier game than the coffee a majority of the viewers, I'm imagining, watching this video will be drinking. Accuracy is an important thing when you're wanting to have consistency and learning how to dial in your coffee so that you don't have to keep redialing every single day. So the first thing I recommend is buying some sort of little kitchen scale. You don't need a fancy schmancy one like the one I have, which is here. It's got coffee on it, espresso on it. You can get an $8 one that is typical for like jewelry weighing, and you can use one of those as long as you know the weight limit and you don't use cups that weigh too much. That'll overdo the scale. Now, the way that you're going to measure your coffee is either with single dosing, so you put a dosing cup the way I've been, and then you fill coffee into said dosing cup like this, and you can weigh the amount that is in your cup. Or you can use a timed feature on your grinder and dial it in based off of how much grounds are coming out. Just zero out your catch cup first, and then play with the different time settings until the output is roughly where you want to be. If you have like a 20 gram dose and you're 0.2 off, that is a percentage, and you don't want to be outside of that 1% margin of error. So I guess it is pretty precise when you think about it, but with how finely we're grinding these coffees and how heavy of pressure of water we're putting through it, you can imagine that a little bit precision is needed if you don't want to just waste a ton of coffee, which is a huge thing that is taught in these courses, is lessen your waste. You don't want to just waste a ton of coffee by overdosing, underdosing, having to toss pucks. That's not sustainable. If there is a mountain of grounds in here and you press it down, the middle will have the highest concentration. If you dump your grounds in and it's rigid like this, there's mountain peaks everywhere and you tamp it down, it's going to have those higher concentrations where the peaks are, and where the valleys are, lower concentration. Your water is going to expose the lower concentration regions of that puck. In order to maximize consistency and heighten sustainability without as much waste, we need to ensure that we have as even of a density prior to tamping. When I was taught as a barista, we would take the lid, essentially, of our hopper, or not of our hopper, but of our that area I told you about earlier with the fan inside, the little doser area. We would take that and we would scrape the excess using the lid as evenly as possible back into this to use later. So that was our way of distribution prior to tamping. But that's not very good. As you can imagine, that does nothing to the distribution on the bottom, and that can be problematic. People found ways of doing what's called stock fleth. You take your fingers like this, kind of like a tight L, and you rotate. Baristas felt really cool doing this back in the day. It was like, yeah, what would you like? They felt really cool doing it. They felt like they knew what was going on. They got coffee on their hands. Gross. So we're not going to do that. Another one is north, south, east, west. Literally, you take your finger and you push the mound north, south, east, west. And you keep doing it until it fills in all of the lacunae. But, of course, we're not going to do that either. What I think is the best way to do it inside of a cafe is just tapping. That means you get your mound in there and you just tap with your knuckle. Even if you have a clumpy grinder, clumps don't really cause that much. If you don't believe me, go check out James Hoffman's CT scans of it. You're going to see that the clumps essentially diminish to nothingness. They're not really going to do very much. Just tap. If you have a really clumpy grinder, okay, fine. You can do some sort of needling, but for the most part, especially in a cafe, tapping's all you need. Things like the NCD, where you put it in and it levels the coffee bed. This was used to get more points in a barista championship because the judges would look at how level your bed was. It was a cheat code. Now cafes use it across the world, but it actually leads to more inconsistent extractions. I also have videos that prove that. I tend to absolutely adore this little guy, this Happy Tamper. Now, I love it because A, it won't give you the same strain on your elbow and everything as a traditional tamper would, like something like this, which has, the handle and then you push down. It also is self-leveling, so if you're in a hurry, you don't really have to worry about going straight in, straight up. Now, of course, people are like, oh, well, great baristas are perfect. Okay, whatever, cool. Of course, you can do the typical tampers as well. It's just you need to make sure all your baristas are perfectly level, because that is actually a pretty important aspect of tamping. One of the big reasons we do it is for the evenness of it. Or you can do an automated tamper. Those do a fine job, and they're consistent and will save your barista's elbows. Or you can do like the little manual one that does this. It's like a lever machine, presses it down. But anyway, whatever you find to be most consistent, go with that, because a bit more tamping or a bit less tamping can have effects on the actual extraction. So you don't want everyone tamping with different pressures. That's another reason why just a normal tamp's not ideal. Some baristas I see, when I walk in, they're doing this with all of their weight, thinking they need to destroy the puck. Other people are just like, we need consistency. You know, I'll go straight to a portafilter because that's what most baristas will do in their cafes. But essentially, I am going to single dose as opposed to working off of gravimetric or timed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and start the grinder. It's just like in a cafe, they have their portafilter here on some sort of stand. I'm going to hold it because I don't have a stand because this isn't really made for portafilters. But essentially what you're going to do to pull your espresso is you're going to have, and again, you can go to a dosing cup and then into here. I'm just showing how a barista would see it. Go there. And essentially your portafilter will fill. Now we know it'll come out with my dose because I've done that. I've done the weighing. Of course, this is messy. That's very messy. You can have this as a home barista, which is to put around the top so that mess doesn't happen. But essentially, and this is a lot more static than I see on commercial grinders. But essentially, when I say horizontal tapping, as you tap, it's going to vibrate these grounds in place. Okay. So you see how it's starting to level out? You don't need to do anything crazy, and you'll get good at it over time. You can even, take your finger and do even smaller ones. But essentially, I just kind of tap like this, and then I give it a nice level tap like so. Then once you have all that inside, I like to wipe those wings off. Then we're going to take our tamper. We put it right here. Tamp down. Done. We load it into the group. I just manhandled that. And we'll take some sort of cup. This cup works. We're not going to weigh it. This is just for presentation. And we have our first shot that we pulled together. Shot from together. The lighter the coffee you use, the less viscosity there will be produced, the less crema there will be produced, the less potential advection there's going to be on the extraction itself. If you have a really dark coffee and somehow you're not able to get that perfect little rat tail in the center, well, maybe it is something with the puck prep. But for the most part, that's not really telling us very much. Naked portafilters are lies. I have a full video dedicated to that. Okay, you can go check that out. But they're not as, they're very misleading essentially. Extraction is the act of water, which is the most powerful solvent in the world, infiltrating the coffee puck, going inside of them and pulling out, yeeting out all the goods from inside. In order to do this, we must have soluble compounds to dissolve, and that's what we're going for, these soluble compounds. The bad news is not all of them are tasty. The idea with this sour sweet bitter is that in the field of extraction, from under extracted here to over extracted here, which those are relative terms to the person. Some people may taste a coffee that's over extracted to some and find it perfect for them. So of course, everything's relative. But in a spectrum of less extracted to more extracted, you should see a clear sour, 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 a bit more sweet, 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 a bit more bitter, bitter, bitter. Our tongues cannot comprehend the sugars inside of coffee. So the sweetness we detect in a good shot of coffee is not from sugar. We don't really know what it's from. There's lots of studies going on right now, but do not believe the sugars come next kind of thing. No. And so while it is a nice rough guideline of sour, sweet, bitter during your extraction phases, it's not a hard rule. Some coffees may act differently. When we're extracting coffee, and you have it on the lower extraction side, and you want to move it to the higher extraction side, there are different ways we can manipulate the variables in order to achieve said higher extraction. If we have really high extraction, we want to lower the extraction to, optimize the sourness or the acidity of the coffee that we might think we're missing, or if we want to improve the body, you might want to go with a little bit less extraction. There are ways of doing that as well. First, grind size. The finer your grind size, the more potential extraction in theory. I say in theory because in espresso, channeling or heterogeneous extraction is rife. It's everywhere. Not Matt rife, not the crowd work guy, but rife with potential channeling. Due to the fact that the finer we go, the more difficult it is for water to go through. Even though more surface area is opened up, it is more difficult for the water to get through. Therefore, the water will expose areas where it's not as well distributed, therefore making some areas much more extracted and other areas much less extracting, bringing the overall extraction of that puck to essentially what it would be if you went a little bit coarser with a more even extraction. Whoa, that was a lot. All I'm saying is, if we hit on a grinder, really fine, really coarse, let's say we achieve a certain extraction yield here at the middle grind size. Now that whole bed could be very evenly extracted. Let's say all parts of it are right at, let's say, 20% extraction. We could go much finer But because the water is going to run through much more unevenly, even with more surface area, the overall extraction could be the same, 20%. It's just that not the whole puck will be at 20%. Some areas at 28%, some areas at 33%, some areas at 12%, because it was so tightly packed and so finely ground, the water was like, ain't no way, my friend, am I going through that. And it doesn't matter the amount of needles you put in it. It doesn't matter the amount of spins you use with your whatever it is. You're not going to get a more even extraction when you're past the point of no return with the fineness of grinding. So remember, the finer you go, the more difficult the coffee becomes. The finer you grind, the more gross coffee becomes. If the only way to reach 9 bar of pressure on your machine is by grinding finer, don't reach 9 bar. Reddit is wrong 9 times out of 10 when it comes to espresso. It's the truth. I'm sorry. Coarser, you're going to get more even flow always. Your grinder will always perform better when you're coarser relative to finer. Coarse is daddy. Under extraction is typically will be marked by the following kind of terms. Sour, salty. It can be thin body if you went too coarse and you under extracted, but it could also be too thick of a body if you went too fine and under extracted. You see what I mean? Or if you have the perfect dial and you just cut it short so there's less water going through, it can be a very thick body. It could be sludge. For instance, if I were to just start a shot and stop it after 6 seconds, that's obviously under extracted. If you were to sip those first few drops of the espresso, you would be mind blown at how sour it was. In fact, I have a quick little thing for you to do. Get a shot of espresso, have it dialed in, and then for every 5 seconds, take a different cup and get the extractant that is pulling out of one portafilter. Taste them all. The first ones will be very salty, very, very salty. It'll be sour, then it'll be kind of nothing, but kind of sweet, whatever. Then when you get to the end, it'll be very astringent, very hot, bitter, watery, etc. So under extracted could be really thick. It's very, very rarely going to be very thin. That's only if you go way too coarse and you don't like the taste of coarser shots. So that's a weird thing to add, but sour, sharp, salty, and I would say like almost too thick to where it's like soy sauce on your tongue. Over extraction, when we go to the other end of things, that's going to be watery because you have a lot of coffee coming out at first and a little bit of water is making it through because the water is being absorbed into the coffee and it's coming out in full force, extracting as much as possible. But then as time goes on, the coffee has less to give and the water comes through more uninhibited. So there's less heat sink into the puck itself, so the water coming out is hotter. There's less coffee coming out, so water is thinner than coffee mixed with water, so the liquid coming out is going to become thinner and thinner, and over time it's going to become lighter and lighter in color. At the first, very dark, like honey-like syrup, and then over time it'll be very watery, very blonde, yellow, pea-like almost, until it becomes almost essentially translucent. Now that doesn't mean, oh, we need to stop by the time it's blonding. That's an old, outdated BS thing. Don't listen to that. Some coffee's blonde right at the start. Don't worry about that. That's so silly. I'm not even going to get into it. It doesn't warrant my attention right now. We all know what we're looking for with balance. It's also relative. It should be balanced acidity for you, balanced sweetness for you. Now, balanced acidity for you could be very acidic for me, or maybe what I like is really acidic for you. So it's all relative, right? But balanced acidity, balanced sweetness, balanced body. No, I would say, without a doubt, no dryness. That's coming from astringency. You don't want your mouth drying out. That's something you never want. If it's drying out, you are over-extracting more than likely, or you're way too fine and you're under-extracting and over-extracting different parts of the puck, so you need to go coarser, counterintuitively. That's a big thing. If you're finding that you feel lost because you say this has examples of over and under-extracted, that means you're too fine because you listened to the Reddit people and you went finer. Don't do that. If you taste a coffee and you think it's a little thin, but you think everything else is perfect, just make sure you're not underdosing the puck a bit. If you are, add a little coffee. If you have a lot of channeling and you pull out that puck and you have just a full screen imprint on it, even before it's wetted, maybe take out a little bit of coffee and it can help you out. So dose is going to help with a static basket. Now also dose will help if you want to get a deeper puck or more shallow puck. So let's say that you have an 18 gram quote unquote basket and you're pulling shots and they're just all thin and weak and you can't go fine enough. before you're getting just crazy channeling. And so you're getting like gushers. And right when you get fine enough, now I can't get it to actually come out. It chokes. Maybe the answer is going up a basket, increasing your dose, which also increases the bed depth. And that is going to help you achieve a bit more body and a bit more sanity. Overall, I'm a fan of deeper pucks, even up to 28 gram pucks in a 58 millimeter basket. I think is fantastic. It's just wasteful of coffee, which is why I prefer smaller diameter espresso machines. Not a big fan of the 58 millimeter one because I don't really like shots with doses less than about 21 grams. Water is the solvent. That's what's doing the extraction. More solvent, more extraction, less solvent, less extraction, period. Now, of course, coffee can only give so much. So if you put 1,000 milliliters of water, a liter of water through espresso, it'll stop at some point. But for the most part, in the area that we're extracting, more water, more extract, less water, less extract. So you have a coffee, you pull it, it seems a little too thick and sour. Don't change the grind size. Just let it extract a little bit longer. Now, of course, you'll also have more contact time, but the contact time is minuscule in comparison to what water will do to the extraction. Same thing. It's a little watery. It's a little drying. It's a little bitter. Just let a little less water go through. Brew time's the next variable. So the amount of contact time will affect the taste of the coffee. So how long is the water in contact with that coffee? I wouldn't really worry about time as much as I would about hitting certain grind sizes. Now, time can be a guide to the right grind size, but I wouldn't worry about time and contact time nearly as much. But more time, more contact time potential, more extraction, less contact time potential, less extraction, though that is a very big potential. Higher temperature, higher potential extraction, lower temperature, lower potential extraction. Higher temperature in big chunks will flow through faster than lower temperature. If you don't believe me, do an 80-degree shot or even a room temperature shot on your home lever machine versus at the same grind size as a boiling shot. The boiling will run through much faster because it's much more efficient at extracting and diffusion properties. It's much more efficient at degassing, so you'll get a much faster shot. I would say if you're drinking light roast, live around the 92 to 93 area. I wouldn't go very much higher. I know it's a shock for people. If you're doing dark roast, 85 to 88 area. Medium, maybe 88 to 90. And then don't really mess with it unless you're doing really fast shots, in which case I would say go even lower temperature. But other than that, I don't really mess with temperature much. Grind size and ratio are the two biggest that I would mess with. And of course, dose. But once you have your dose, you don't really want to change that too much. So next we have measurement and tools. Of course, we have precision scales, which are very helpful. You want to be able to measure within 0.1 gram, which is great. A refractometer. This is something you do not need, but cafes, it's pretty helpful. This will measure the total dissolved solids inside of a beverage itself, meaning it shoots a light through a prism and it refracts off of the elements inside of the liquid that you put here in your sample, and it will read to you a percentage. That percentage is how much of the liquid that you put into this dish is not water. Now, to calculate extraction yield is very simple. We get the total dissolved solids, which is the percentage of our espresso or our filter coffee that is actually coffee. That's not water. You don't need this at home. This helps cafes be more consistent day to day when they get a new coffee, and they may know that maybe it tastes best around a specific TDS. Maybe their pour over community, the people they serve, they've noticed a trend. They like weaker coffees than stronger, or vice versa. And this can help them get into that range as opposed to relying on any one person's palate. They can be a bit more objective with it. So espresso tends to be around 9 to 12. We'll say 10 for the sake of math. Our dose of coffee, let's say, was 20 grams. Our yield, the amount of espresso we need to know, let's say we yielded it at 50 grams. What we would do to solve the extraction yield, which is the amount of the coffee that actually is in our final cup, is we'd say, okay, we had a 50 gram yield multiplied by our 10% TDS. That equals 500. Then we'll divide it by 20. That's a 25% extraction. So what that means is 25% of our dose is now in our final cup, which means a 20 gram dose, 25% of that is 5 grams. That means if we were to take our puck right here, we were to dehydrate it, we should measure only 15 grams of coffee left because 5 grams of it are now in here in two forms, in solubles and in insolubles. Okay, that means there are cell wall fragments, there are some like lipids and polysaccharides and things that have gotten through, but there are also solubles, things that have dissolved, the chemicals, the acids, etc., that have dissolved from the coffee itself. When we're talking about sensory and tasting, the flavor wheel is something that has gone through multiple iterations over the years. This is literally a wheel with different colors and shows different ways of tasting the coffee with correlative types of foods that you can relate to the flavors with. They try to do this in different colors as well as in different tints of the colors. So if you taste a coffee, you taste red, go to the red on the flavor wheel and try to see which one the taste reminds you of. This is a good way to help you and other people calibrate on what you're tasting in a coffee with some sort of map. I'm not a huge fan of it. I don't use it a ton because taste is so subjective around the world based off of your cultural background that it makes it difficult for me to trust something like this. But in the end, this is what they teach, is their flavor wheel. You can download one and use it. You can print it off, put it at your brew bar, and try to work on tasting using that. Maybe you can have friends you calibrate with. It is a nice tool if you use it with a tasting group and you try to calibrate to that. But you also need to look at their reference points for the flavors that they mention. Understanding the reference point is very important as well. Ethiopia, you could have a city here and another city 8 hours away. They could have a blended coffee and you could call it single origin. So single origin just means one country, one origin of where that coffee is coming from. Blends that coffee shops make or that roasters make, the idea of it is to blend out intense flavors with more smooth flavors to give you a consistent, repeatable profile. Now, I personally think blends that have more than 2 beans are silly because there's no way you can guarantee you're getting even amounts of those beans with every dose. If you have a 4-bean blend, you can't guarantee me my 20-gram dose has exactly 5 grams of each of those coffees. They all have different extraction properties, all the different coffees. They have different taste profiles. Every single shot could be polar different. You might have a gusher and the next one could be a choked shot. That's not fun. So with blends, I always recommend that cafes or roasteries do, at worst 2 beans that are like 60-40 at the biggest differences. The idea is to level out flavor profiles. So maybe you get a really intense acidic Ethiopia and you pair it with a really chocolatey, nutty Brazil, and that way you get like berries and cream and chocolate. Now when we're pairing with milk, which we'll do milk in the next video, it is going to mute acidity and improve the sweetness of the beverage. If you have a really light Ethiopia with a ton of acidity, you could still get some of that acidity in the final cup, but it's going to just completely kill the taste of coffee altogether. You're going to taste a milk beverage with maybe even a little curdling of the crema, which I've seen before in really acidic coffees, but and especially with soy milk. Soy milk tends to curdle a lot with espressos, especially light roast. But anyway, blending milk with them is going to bring a ton of sweetness from the milk itself, of course, and it will mute some of that acidity. So you want to be able to pair your milk with espressos that can stand up in milk while also bringing something that's specific, that's not necessarily just nuts and rubber. Anyway, that was a really long video, much longer than I meant for it to be, but hopefully still binge-worthy. But anyway, if I spoke too quickly, you can go down to 0.75 times down below. It's fine. You can watch it again, whatever. But I would really appreciate it if you would take a moment, hit the like, subscribe. I'm trying to make education more accessible to people, trying to get reviews out that will help people know what to do with their money or be more informed with their money. My whole goal with this is accessibility and breaking down the wall where people feel like coffee snobbery is, unapproachable. I want people to enjoy this beautiful beverage that I love and to partake in this global event that is going on around a singular beverage. Get ready for a video number 3. If you still haven't watched video 1, I recommend doing that. It's a background to espresso or background to coffee in general. This was our espresso basics. Next, we'll get into milk steaming, latte art, and that fun stuff. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you brew something tasty today with your newfound knowledge or with brushed up knowledge or interesting knowledge maybe you didn't have before. But anyway, that's enough for me here at Lance Hedrick Studios. It's not really called that. It's my garage. But thank you so much. I hope that you brew something tasty today. And cheers.